Chapter 15 of Abandoned by William Clark Russell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. Abandoned by William Clark Russell. Chapter 15. Mr. Goodhart offers marriage. On the morning following the life-saving incident, Reynolds awoke and found himself heavy, depressed, low with malaise. He felt his pulse, 70. He got out of bed, opened the dressing-case and took out a clinical thermometer. His temperature was 103½ degrees. He quite understood that this signified a return of Malta fever, whether due to his plunge last evening, or to the perception of certain secreted microscopic bacilli that a time had come when they should make their presence felt, was not of the smallest consequence. The remedy was bed, patience, and abstinence. He kept his room all day, but his yearning after Lucretia was so great that he must needs write this note to her. "Dear Mrs. Reynolds, I am confined to my room by a slight attack of Mediterranean fever, but hope to be well to-morrow, and in any case to be able to meet you on the day following. Possibly I shall find you on the Eastcliff Esplanade at 5 o'clock. Let me definitely name the day after to-morrow, when I hope you will return with me to drink tea. I am afraid I shall not be able to tell you anything about Captain Reynolds' money by then, because before the bank remits they will require proof of Captain Reynolds' death. But I have referred them to Lloyd's and to other authorities, and have little doubt that before a week has passed I shall have the pleasure to hand you a cheque. With kind regards, yours very truly, John Goodhart." He used pencil and took great care to disguise his hand, which he readily contrived as he wrote in bed, and his writing was a ragged scrawl. He sent this note to be delivered by hand. Next to talking to her, it pleased him to write to her. Goodhart's prophecy had come to pass. The old magic had done its work. The spell was on him. How passionately was he loving her! Never more so than now, never even in days when his heart was younger by 8 years, when it had not been chilled and sickened by unnatural and unwomanly revolt, when love was sweet and fresh with the glory of the rose on the bush, not the rose in the hand, nor the petal of memory betwixt the leaves in the shut volume of years. And it was his passion to possess her that determined him to go on wooing her as he now was, as Goodhart, a stranger, an acquaintance, a fast-ripening friend of deep sympathy, a man to be trusted and honoured, to whose custody, absolutely convinced that her husband Frank was dead, she might in time be coaxed and courted into committing the delicate, precious charge of her virginal being. And you will suppose that to the degree of his desire for her was his fear of detection, lest the old loathing should return like the entry of a hideous fiend, to tear and rend to pieces the machinery of a mind that was to be likened to some hall of ice far north, a moonlit vision of white pillars, and roof gleaming with cold stars, and a floor upon which no fairy that ever sang with the grasshoppers in the land of romance would choose to dance. He lay in a bedroom from which he could view the sea shining in a blue lake-like surface, and, lying alone, he thought much of his term of solitude on the island. How different his condition when he had the fever there from what it was now. How he had dragged his legs of lead, and poised his head like a hot cannon-ball between his shoulders, to the foam of the cataract's stroke, how he had lain in his cheerless crack of earth, gazing with fevered eyes at the stars, and wondering how long he should live, and thinking of Lucretia as he now thought of her. His mind rambled to the old sea-chest, and to the letter he had nailed to the lid, and this memory caused him to consider that he had not made a will, and if he died, and nobody could prove his identity, his money would be lost to Lucretia. He deliberated how he should go to work. He would not trust a local lawyer with the secret. The gentleman might be a member of the club at Ramsgate, and some provincial lawyers talk about their clients as some provincial doctors talk about their patients, so that if he went to a lawyer in Ramsgate to make his will, his secret business might, God knows how, leak out and trickle to that one ear in the world whose reception of it might desolate his heart and bring his fabric of self-respect down upon his head in dusty ruin. He rose early next day, being perfectly recovered from his attack, and took the train to Deal. This little town is seated opposite the Downs. It is remarkable for the number of its public houses. Its beach is a shelving shore of shingle, up which the surf rushes with a noise like the escape of steam, and down which it shales in a conflict of foaming water and dark gleaming pebbles, which rattle as they are torn along. Boats called galley punts repose on this shingle, with their noses pointed at the sea, and their sterns at tall skeleton capstans to which they are connected by ropes. And when one of these boats comes ashore from a cruise, a number of aged men, who shape themselves out of you don't know what or where, gather about the capstan the boat belongs to, ship bars, and begin to wind round and round, a slow, tuneless and melancholy circus of very old men in broken boots, patched breeches, tall hats discoloured by age and weather into the aspect of bronze, and faces often so ancient that to explore them is like opening old coffins, or like watching a mask of almost eyeless wrinkles, vital in nothing save a movement of jaw which betokens that the withered curve of gum, with its one stump of 93 years, is still busy with the little cube of tobacco. The beach and esplanade are noticeable for a class of persons called boatmen, who wear yellow trousers and blue jerseys, from the breasts of which they will pull down a newspaper or a parcel of letters sent ashore by a skipper for the post, and these men, who are nearly always starving, and therefore ask most fraudulent and monstrous sums of money to take you off or put you ashore, devote the greater part of their lives to the study of that fine art of the British longshore, the art of lounging. No boatman in Great Britain can loaf, lounge, and lean with such superiority of lazy, drunken idles, sulking, dumbly cursing postures as the Deal man. He is born for something to lean against, to lean upon with folded arms, to lean over, to loll at. The whole indolence of the man blends with the object he polishes with breech, elbow, or hip, and he and the capstan he sprawls upon, or he and the pillar or post he leans against, are so much one that a dog and his tail are not more united. Reynolds walked from the station to the esplanade. The hour was a little after 10, early, but Reynolds desired to do his business and return to entertain Lucretia at his hotel. Ramsgate was lost to sight in the milky softness of cliff that contained it, and that faded in a glimmering white film in the blue air. The sea was brushed by a soft south-west wind, and glanced and danced in little frolicking curls, every one of which ran with a white feather in its head, and the broad liquid table, upbearing its burden of curtsying ships in the Downs, was a wide and lovely tremble of sparkles, like the shivering of the tiny suns in summer trees, when the green leaves are fretted by the kisses of the breeze. Just there, where that brig with grey hull, raking masts, the flag of Brazil at her trysail gaff, her chocolate-coloured girl of figurehead sinking in endless bows to the gaunt steamer ahead, sitting hollow upon the water, with the bewildered look of a balloon that comes down from the clouds suddenly to sea, and strains and floats for a little while, aimless and imbecile, just there lay the Flying Spur in October 1890, and this was June 1898. Lucretia was on board, loathing him. Lucretia was now yonder, where the low land lifted into a rampart of chalk. He was Goodhart, and she did not loathe him. What would be the mood that fired her, that should sweep her into his arms, or drag her back in renewed access of the passion of chastity, when she discovered that he was her husband? Which must certainly happen before they came together, and therefore would happen, for he meant to possess her. A boatman who was leaning over the back of a seat called out, "Put you aboard any ship out there, sir?" "No. Do you belong to Deal?" "Why, I should rather think I do," answered the man, grinning over the folded arms he leaned upon. "Who's a good lawyer in this town?" "A good lawyer?" echoed the fellow, with a large and silly stare at another man who had indolently strolled up, scenting half a pint. "If you want a good lawyer, you'll find him in one of them ship's fo'c'sles," with a nod at the ships in the Downs. "They knows what's what, and mourns what's what, if they're furriners. You'll get no advice worth listening to at Deal, unless it's a magistrate's, who'll lock yer up for a month, if it's the bobby's wish, and 'im in with your wife, and both wantin' yer out of it." He scowled at his mate. The question appeared to have touched a sore in the man's mind. Indeed, his feelings were so strong that he even stood upright to deliver his views. Reynolds walked into the High Street, obtained the address of a solicitor from a stationer who produced a directory, and called at once at the office. He was kept waiting, and sat listening to a bald-headed clerk on a three-legged stool, scratching time with his pen to the ticking of a large leering clock over his head. A man entered. He was dressed in blue cloth, and kept his cap on. His face was like a piece of underdone beef, blue and red, cobwebbed with scarlet filaments, and his eyes glowed damply, like the reflection of the sun in the Thames on a foggy day. "Mr. Grundy in?" he asked. "Engaged, sir," answered the clerk. "How long'll he be?" "A few minutes. This gentleman's waiting." "Good morning," said the man, bestowing a purple nod on Reynolds, and sitting down. Reynolds slightly started. He knew the man as one Captain Carson, had met him at several ports, and had dined with him at Singapore. His nod alarmed him. Was he recognized? His mind speedily cleared. Captain Carson did not know him. "Sure on business, sir?" said Captain Carson, pulling out a case of cigarettes, and extending it to Reynolds, who declined, then to the clerk, who with obvious regret also declined. "All my business is done ashore," answered Reynolds. "Oh, I thought you belonged to my cloth. You're lucky not to be master of a ship." And he began a story about his crew, how they all came aboard drunk, how the ship was brought to Gravesend by lumpers and runners, where she was left to swing till her men were sober enough to stand upright, how, after letting go the anchor in the Downs, they all lay aft, and said they didn't mean to proceed in the ship, as she leaked, which was a lie, as most of her principal masts were sprung, which was another lie, as she was down by the head, and all her running gear rotten, and not a ratlin strong enough for a rat to sling by. All lies. They were ashore, and so was he. All the time this captain talked, Reynolds marvelled at the change that had been wrought in his own personal appearance, so that this man should not have the least idea who he was, which somehow impressed him even more than his wife's failure to detect him. He was liberated from the obligation of following a violent attack on the character of the merchant sailor by somebody stepping out of the inner office, and the solicitor in the doorway asking him to walk in. His business was simple, and was to be easily disposed of. He wished to leave all that he owned to his wife, in language unclouded by legal verbiage, so that his intention could not be misunderstood. He named the manager of the bank he did business with in London, and a gentleman who resided in Sydney, New South Wales, as executors. "When can you let me have this will?" "The day after to-morrow. To-morrow is County Court, and I have a number of cases to attend to." "A good deal of quarrelling goes on here, I believe." "The boatmen love the law, and numbers of petty tradesmen in the district, village grocers and the like, who sell everything from a joint of beef to a bird cage, are constantly failing, or suing, or being sued." "Kindly address the document to Mr. John Goodhart," said Reynolds, naming the hotel and town, and, paying the fee, he walked out, exchanging a nod with Carson as he passed. He returned to Ramsgate with a heart as light as the June day about him, that rejoiced in the blue sky, in the song of the lark. He was acting his part well, and who or what sings more sweetly and gratefully to a man than his own conscience when it is happy and at rest? His heart was putting in some special pleading for Lucretia. His concessions were liberal. If her faith had been unfaithful, she had not been falsely true. She wore his ring, and his likeness rose and fell with the breathing of her breast and the beating of her heart. She had remained his wife, though she believed herself a widow. In this, was she true to herself or to him? The solution of such a problem could signify nothing. Few know themselves. Perhaps no man, however searching in lifelong introspection, knows himself. The mood of the hour before dinner is not the mood of the hour after dinner. Lucretia before her marriage was surely not the Lucretia she was changed into by her marriage, or would she have married? At 5:30 he was on the Esplanade, waiting. A pale young woman of London, holding a small boy by the hand, came along. When she saw Reynolds, she cried out, "Oh, Georgie, there's the gentleman that saved your life!" And with an emotion of gratitude that gave a moment's refinement of beauty to the coarseness of her prettiness, she added, "I do thank you so much, sir. I couldn't have borne to lose him. What would my husband have thought? He'd write, and gladly to thank you, if not too great a liberty, but your name and address are unknown." Reynolds smiled, and called the little boy to him, and taking a crown piece from his pocket, said, "Georgie, you can be a sailor and feel easy. You are not born to be drowned. Which would you like best, a horse and cart, or a ship to swim in a pool in the sands?" "A ship to swim in a pool in the sands," echoed the boy in a level voice. "Then go and buy her," said Reynolds. The boy's small fingers hooked themselves upon the big coin with the avariciousness of tender youth. "I thank you kindly, sir," said the London mother. "Thank the gentleman, Georgie," Every night you kneel down you will ask God to bless him, won't you? I'd like him to thank you, sir, by singing a little song his father learned him." But just then Lucretia turned the corner. The London mother's eyes followed Reynolds' gaze, and she saw it was time to go. "I hope you are very much better, Mr. Goodhart," said Lucretia. "Malta fever is like a brother who has gone wrong. He makes you hear of him from time to time," answered Reynolds. She was dressed in white, and was in truth a very handsome, indeed beautiful presence, princess-like, if by that term dignity, stature, carriage, and command of person be meant. Never a man passed by who did not favour her with a glance or stare, nor were her own sex unobservant of her. "I hope I made my meaning clear in the scrawl I sent from my bed," he said. "Perfectly. I thought it so very kind of you to think of me when you were ill." "It gives me pleasure to serve you," he exclaimed with cautious warmth, feeling his way. "It seems strange," said she, "that one who reminds me indefinitely of my husband should have found his letter, brought his gift, and continue to act towards me as though you had been friends. I showed you his likeness. I suppose you never met him?" "What commands did he hold?" "Oh, he went as captain of 2 or 3 mail steamers. I think the line was the Elder Dempster. There is such a firm?" "Certainly." "And he also commanded several sailing ships. One was a celebrated clipper, and he would speak with enthusiasm of her beauty under sail or lying at anchor. She was called the Lancashire Lass." "I know the ship," said Reynolds gravely. "My husband, when he sailed on his last voyage in 1890, had been about 18 years at sea." "He must have been young when he held command." "He was. But in these days of steam, voyages are so rapid that, as Captain Reynolds used to say, you can pack 3 or 4 voyages into a year, and if you obtain fresh appointments, whether in the same company or others, a comparatively young sailor may claim to have seen a great deal in a short time." "True." "It would be strange," she exclaimed, looking thoughtfully upon the ground as they walked, "if you had met him unconsciously, I mean, on a pier or in a street in a foreign port, and in ignorance that you had once looked at him or he at you, you had brought home his letter." "It may be that Reynolds and I have met in the way you suggest. Englishmen are plentiful. They are repeatedly coming across one another," said he, speaking behind his beard, moustache, and pince nez, with a face that was purely Goodhart to her. They entered the hotel, and were presently seated at a tea-table at an open window. He told her that he had run across to Deal in the morning, and they chatted on several no matters till Reynolds brought the conversation back again to them both. "I think you told me that Captain Reynolds meant to take you to sea with him when he went on his last voyage." She raised her eyebrows and exclaimed, "Did I? I don't remember." "Had you gone," he continued, "you would have been shipwrecked. It's true your life might have been preserved as his was, but if he was the only survivor, no sailor would give the value of that strawberry in your hand for your chances, for your husband's first care would be for you. It must have been the lowered boat, and since none lived but he, you would have gone with the rest." "Yet my place as his wife was with him," she said, looking through the window at the sea. It was fortunate for the concealment he sought that their eyes did not meet, whilst the sudden look that almost transformed his face stayed for a few breaths only, He took up a prawn, and seemed lost in contemplation of its workmanship, but after no very long pause said, "No doubt a wife's right and only place is at her husband's side." "I have felt the truth of this since you brought me Captain Reynolds' letter," she said quietly. "I understand. You feel, as all must see, that your husband's last thoughts were with you." "The subject is a sad one, Mr. Goodhart." He was very willing indeed to change the conversation, but though his heart was on fire with her words, he perfectly understood that if ever a moment for the revelation of his identity was to come, it had not come yet. Memory rising between them shaped herself spirit-wise, forefinger on lip, hand lifted in command of silence. She spoke in intuition, exhorting him not to hasten, but to consider that his avowal of imposition as Goodhart might flood his wife with the disgust that had been excited by the Gravesend stratagem which had kidnapped her, to no purpose. "I find this hotel expensive, at least for my purse," said he, "but I am so well pleased with Ramsgate that I mean to stay on." He looked at her significantly. She did not seem to heed him, but if any thought present in him was interpreted by her, its construction produced not the slightest change in her face. "I shall go into lodgings. I have no home. Indeed, I have had no home since my wife left me. The Colonial is more cosmopolitan than other peoples who have countries. He loves the land of his birth, and would die for her with as much enthusiasm and loyalty as any Briton for the old home. But he does not suffer as others do from contraction of mind in respect of his thoughts of his country. The roving spirit that made his sires colonists is still unquenched, though in a few generations it will be extinct. The Australian can make himself a home anywhere and be happy in it. The Briton is always yearning to return. I could make myself very happy in Ramsgate." He was again addressing her with significance of look and tone. "Where shall I find a comfortable lodging?" "I doubt if I know as much of the place as you do." "Shall you seek another afternoon engagement?" he asked, smiling at her. "Yes, and I shall be thankful to find one." "Meanwhile, as you are at liberty, it would be delightful to me to enjoy a larger share of your company than your time has permitted." If, instead of being Reynolds, he had in good sooth been Goodhart, it might be held that he was pressing her a little unhandsomely, for she was under a great obligation to him, and he was still in course of obliging her, and his advance would appear as though he was taking advantage of his singular relations with her. Her colourless cheeks slightly flushed, but she smiled whilst she said, "I must hope not to have too much time on my hands." "Are you disengaged to-morrow afternoon?" "Yes." "Will you come for a drive and dine with me here?" "I will go for a drive, with pleasure, but you must excuse me for declining your kind invitation to dine." "Now, why?" he asked, with a broad, blunt candour that caused her to bring her brows a little together in the seeking, the penetrating look she fastened upon him. "What time shall I be here, Mr. Goodhart?" she inquired, with a release of gaze that left her face charged and troubled with thought. He named 3:00, perceiving it was not her wish he should call for her. They lingered a while in odds and ends of talk. She then put on her gloves, and he conducted her to the entrance of the hotel, where they parted. At 3 next afternoon a carriage stood at the door of the hotel. Lucretia arrived with the punctuality of royalty. She got into the carriage, Reynolds followed, and they were driven away for a summer jaunt through Broadstairs to the North Foreland. There is no pleasanter drive in this smiling country of green lanes and spreading orchards and gleaming coil of river, and green slope of down, and large moist eye of violet sea betwixt the breaks of coast, than this that Reynolds and Lucretia were taking. She was dressed as on the previous day, and her enjoyment of the drive was soon expressed in a clearer brilliance of eye, and in that illumination of face which is not a smile, though it produces the effect of one. Their talk was for a long while on very little matters. She was particular in her inquiries about Sidney. She avowed a very strong leaning towards making use of the money Mr. Goodhart had kindly sent her through Mr. Wembley Jones, by trying her fortune in Australia. If more was to come, then, if the sum amounted to even £100, she believed she would make up her mind to go out and start a school. Reynolds smiled, but offered no further opinion. Here, said he, as they drove through Broadstairs, lived a man who knew human nature as well as Shakespeare. You might give offence if you said that he knew human nature better. But if you find no Lear nor Hamlet nor Macbeth in the works of Dickens, neither in the works of Shakespeare do you find Mrs. Gamp, nor Mr. Bumble, and Mr. Squeers, and Mantalini, and how many more immortals? They say he wrote Bleak House in that building perched up yonder. Of course you love Dickens? I remember that my husband was always quoting from him. The more you tell me about Captain Reynolds, the higher you raise him in my esteem. I wish it had been my good fortune to have found him on the island and brought him back to you. Coachman? Sir? You can stop at the lighthouse. We'll get out and take a turn. This Foreland cliff is not tall, but it is bold, and its face of rugged chalk stares upon the most wonderful maritime highway in the world. Ships pass comparatively close in, and the picture is vivid with dimension, grand and romantic in colour and shape, and profoundly interesting, one should imagine, to even a thin thinker, by virtue of its infinite variety, and the ideas with which contemplation of it swells and elevates the mind. As they alighted from the carriage, a bright sketch was in full view large upon the water. It was a steel sailing ship, close hauled, luffing up for the Downs under all plain sail, 3 pyramids of ascending clouds of snowy whiteness, with many silent, delicately shadowed wings between. The foam was rolling forwards from her sharp metal forefoot, but a steady stream of it ran along her sides to unite at her rudder in a wake of prisms and bells of froth, and leapings and lights, which struck into the blue air, closing down with the sudden transcendent splendour of the diamond. She was not so far off but that you saw a figure or two moving upon her quarter-deck. Reynolds stood still and looked at her. Lucretia was by his side. Within a short distance rose the sturdy, storm-defiant figure of the lighthouse, with its building and its lantern, that at nightfall should change into a roaring star, reverberating in flashes the light of a sun. "What a very pretty sight!" exclaimed Lucretia. "I always think a sailing ship makes a daintier picture than a steamer. It may be because sails give a blandness and fulness and dignity which a chimney-stack can never supply." "She should remind you of a ship your husband commanded," said Reynolds, bringing his thoughts away from a sudden vision of a ship on fire in the thick of a living gale, and a little island close aboard. "The Flying Spur?" "No, that clipper you spoke of. The Lancashire Lass. I wonder what will be the fate of yonder craft. Every ship has her destiny, as man has. If I were a ship, I should say, let me perish by fire or foundering, or in any fashion that touches not the honour of the ship, but do not make me a coal hulk. Were you ever at sea in a sailing ship?" "I accompanied Captain Reynolds to Falmouth in the Flying Spur." "How did you enjoy the trip?" "I was very sick, and—" She turned her eyes a little round about her, and added, "I could not enjoy myself, for I was angry at being taken, and you cannot enjoy yourself when you are in a bad temper." "Why should you have gone if you didn't like the idea of the trip? But, of course, Mrs. Reynolds, you went to gratify your husband. Had you persevered, your sickness would have passed, and with it, naturally, your bad humour." It would tease the reader to be informed of every turn of eye, every tone of speech, every shade of gravity, which was indeed in his case irony and satire, the several manners he put on when he conversed with her. Sometimes he would observe her silently and intently regarding him, but his performance was so adroit, he was so deceptive in his language about his wife having left him, by which he understood him to mean Mrs. Goodhart's death, to his references to himself as if he were an Australian, and the like, that, believing her husband dead in his island, and perceiving nothing but certain traits or opinions in this Mr. Goodhart that in any way brought up her Frank Reynolds of St. Stephen's Church before her, she lay under as complete a deception during this drive as she had in all their previous meetings and conversations. They were now addressing each other with that easiness, it need not be called familiarity or freedom, which results from association. They roamed about for a short while inspecting the interior of the lighthouse, chatting with the keeper, who told them of beautiful and strange birds swept by the storm of the night against the radiant glass and found dead, and of the dulness of his life when he was lightsman aboard the Gull, and afterwards the East Goodwin, and then the South Sandhead lightships. How in his day the old Triton did the relieving work, a vessel that rolled heavily in still waters at her berth at the West Pier, that could not steam above 4½ knots, that could not do 6 with a gale of wind astern of her, so that in heavy weather the lightsmen who kept watch in the lonely hulks round about the sands, and from the North Foreland to Dungeness, were sometimes obliged to wait a fortnight and 3 weeks for the relief. "Hard upon men, sir, who in winter consider a month's old newspaper fresh, and have nothing to do but tend the lights and watch for ship's flares to send up rockets for the lifeboat." Lucretia declined to ascend to the summit of the lighthouse. She said she was afraid. So they returned to the carriage and drove away towards Ramsgate. "Won't you reconsider your decision as to dining with me, Mrs. Reynolds?" said he. "I am sure you will excuse me." "Will you drink tea at Broadstairs? It is disagreeable to me to think that you should bear the fatigue of this long drive, and the heat, without refreshment." "I shall enjoy a cup of tea very much indeed. But there is no fatigue. The drive is charming, and the heat with this breeze is delightful." Reynolds told the coachman to stop at the best hotel in Broadstairs. There they stayed for half an hour, drinking tea and eating brown bread and shrimps. Though their talk was of anything, she could not fail to notice that Mr. Goodhart's eyes were very constant in their observation of her. She was perfectly sensible that she was in the presence of a man who admired her, and was even in love with her, and her manner grew very thinly glazed as they sat at the tea-table in the bay window. This cold surface, though transparent enough to suffer the visual expression of any play of feeling, tranquillized her exterior to a calmness that was not remote from austerity. He recollected that much such an expression of face was hers when they had stood side by side at the altar, and walked side by side back to Mrs. Lane's modest little house. There was a tone of constraint in her voice. If she attended to his speech with a look, it was soon averted. Indeed, in her eyes he saw that her spirit had hoisted its glittering storm signals, and it was with the transport of a husband about to attempt an experiment whose success would be a death-blow to his vanity and his love, that he saw that any claims which Mr. Goodhart might have upon her gratitude would not entitle him even to a peep into that sanctuary of her heart in which the flame of the one love of her life, though burning dimly, was to be found, and perhaps, he could but hope it, to be fanned and fed into the sweet, clear light it was when she consented to be his wife. They left the hotel and again entered the carriage. The way before them was a short drive. Scarcely were they in the carriage and in motion than, planting his eyes upon her through his pince-nez, he exclaimed, "It has given me a great, a singular pleasure to make your acquaintance." She bowed and smiled, but her smile was no encouragement to him to proceed. "I am alone in the world," he continued. "I have often regretted that since it was the will of God Mrs. Goodhart should die, her little one had not been preserved to yield the sunshine and warmth of a child's love to its parent. You, too, are alone, Mrs. Reynolds." "I do not know what you would wish to say to me, Mr. Goodhart," she answered, with a visible hardening of her whole demeanour, and an undissembled shrinking of her fine figure into the corner of the seat she occupied. "I have never felt less lonely since the term of my loneliness began," said Reynolds, with a melancholy and solemnity of tone and look that was markedly effective in its impression on her, as he easily saw in the shining, inquisitorial stare of her enlarged eyes, "than during the time I have spent in Ramsgate and in your society. I am a man of independent means. Nothing could render me so happy as to feel that I was the instrument of providing you with a settlement that should make you independent of a vocation you abhor, that should indeed keep you easy and comfortable in your circumstances for the rest of your life. It is true I am not a young man. I have no special favours of face or person to grace my suit, or enrich it by that silent eloquence which women much, indeed chiefly, admire in men. I have led a hard life. The sea is an exacting calling. It has left me rugged. But it has left me an honourable man, with a heart capable of dedicating itself in lifelong affection to such a woman as you, Mrs. Reynolds. Will you be my wife?" She looked steadily away from him for some moments. Her face was as rigid and, in truth, as colourless as marble. "I am sorry, Mr. Goodhart," she said, turning slowly in her stately way upon him, "that you should have asked me that question." You have been so kind to me that the pain you cause me by obliging me to absolutely refuse you must be keener than any I can inflict."
"No, no."
"I should be grieved indeed to lose your friendship, but our relations could never go beyond that."
"Am I to think that you still believe your husband to be alive?" he asked, always preserving his gravity and his melancholy.
"I was not the wife I should have been to my husband. I remember all, and before God I vow that whilst life remains I shall be his wife, and true to him." She spoke with a vehemence that was dangerous in one so passionless, so collected, so resolved, of a deportment and exterior so admirably under control. Why did he not then and there confess himself? His making love to her as Goodhart had touched the mute chords of her memory of Reynolds and woke them into music and feeling. The hand seemed upon the second, the mood seemed to exactly fit the wish. The ripened fruit, to fall, seemed to need no more than the breath that is between lips meeting in a kiss. Thoughts flew through his brains with the velocity of the clouds, of the mind driven by the gales of the passions. He reasoned, "If I say I am Frank Reynolds, she, after the first convulsion and riot of feeling, might find herself possessed again by the spirit that banished me and widowed her. And chagrin and mortification might accompany the discovery that, for the second time, I had duped her." Memory exhorted him to hold his peace in the name of his love, his honour, and his dignity. After a silence that ran into many moments, he said, without looking at her, "You are infinitely raised in my admiration. You do well to be loyal to a man who was manifestly loyal to you, even in his lonely dying hours. You make me feel ignoble as an intruder." "No, no, Mr. Goodhart," she cried in a sobbing voice. "I thank you for the gracious way in which you have taken me."
"We shall remain friends?"
"Oh, I hope so!" she exclaimed cordially, with emotion colouring her smile with a tender sweetness her lips did not always wear in approval or mirth. The hotel was in sight. She asked that the carriage might be stopped. "I have thoroughly enjoyed the afternoon," she said, as they stood together at the side of the carriage. "But the pleasantest part has been the last part, because now you allow me to think of you as a friend, and, above all, we understand each other." They shook hands, and she walked towards her lodging, whilst Reynolds re-entered the carriage to be driven to the hotel. Chapter 15